No one knows who the Stoneman of Calcutta was. That's the honest answer. The name belongs to a ghost, a phantom, who haunted the city's streets and then vanished. He was a killer who left behind bodies but no clues. He terrified a metropolis of millions and was never caught. His identity is a blank space, a question that has lingered for decades. To understand the Stoneman, you have to understand the fear he created. And you have to accept that some stories don't have an ending. The story starts in the summer of 1989. Calcutta, now Kolkata, was a city teeming with life, noise, and people. It was a city of immense wealth and deep poverty, often side by side. For hundreds of thousands of people, home was the pavement. They were the city's forgotten population, rickshaw pullers, daily wage laborers, beggars, the homeless. They lived their lives in public, sleeping on flattened cardboard boxes or thin mats under the open sky. They were vulnerable, but they were part of the city's fabric. And then, someone started targeting them. The first murder didn't cause a panic. It happened in June. A homeless person was found dead in the central part of the city. Their head had been crushed with a heavy object. It was brutal, but in a city of Calcutta's size, a single, violent death in the slums or on the streets wasn't front-page news. The victim was anonymous, someone without power or connections. The police treated it as just another homicide, likely the result of a drunken brawl or a personal dispute. There was no reason to think it was anything more, but then it happened again. And again, a pattern began to emerge, a grim and terrifying routine. The victims were always pavement dwellers. They were always attacked while they slept. The method was always the same, a single, crushing blow to the head with a heavy slab of stone or a concrete block, often weighing as much as 30 kilograms. The killer never took anything. There was no robbery, no sexual assault, no apparent motive at all. The only goal seemed to be the act of killing itself. It was clean, it's in its own gruesome way. The killer would find a sleeping person, lift the heavy stone, and bring it down. Then he would melt back into the city's shadows. The press caught on. Journalists connected the dots between the murders. They needed a name for this faceless killer, something that captured the horror of his method. They called him the Stoneman. The name stuck. It was simple, direct, and chilling. It spread through the city like a virus, whispered in markets, discussed in tea stalls, and printed in bold headlines. The Stoneman of Calcutta was born. With the name came the fear. The city's pavement dwellers were terrified. These were people who already lived on the margins, facing hunger, disease, and exploitation. Now they couldn't even sleep. Sleep, the only escape they had become the most dangerous thing they could do. They started sleeping in groups for safety. Some would take turns staying awake, keeping watch over their friends and family. Others tried to find shelter in more crowded, well-lit areas like train stations. But the Stoneman was relentless. The killings were concentrated in a few specific areas. The Howrah Bridge, a massive steel artery connecting Calcutta to its twin city Howrah, was one hotspot. The areas around it were filled with people sleeping on the streets. The central districts of Bobazar and Baniapur also saw attacks. The killer seemed to know the city's geography intimately, navigating its labyrinthine lanes and bylanes with ease. He struck at night, usually in the hours just before dawn, when the city was at its quietest and his victims were in their deepest sleep. The Calcutta police were in an impossible situation. They were dealing with a type of crime they had never seen before. This wasn't a gang war or a crime of passion. It was the work of a serial killer, a concept that was more familiar from Western news reports than from the streets of India. Their investigative methods were not equipped for this kind of phantom. Their first major problem was the lack of evidence. The murder weapon was always a stone or concrete block found at the scene, something picked up from a nearby construction site or a broken pavement. It offered no fingerprints. The killer left no other forensic traces. DNA analysis was not a standard tool for Indian police in 1989. So, the crime scenes were barren, they had a body and a bloody rock, and that was it. The second problem was the victims. They were the poorest of the poor. They had no documented history, no fixed address, and often no family to speak of. It was hard for the police to even identify them. This made it impossible to build a victim profile or find a connection between them. Why were these specific people being chosen? Was it random? Or was there a logic that only the killer understood? The victims had no known enemies who would want to kill them in such a specific, brutal way. They had no money to steal, they were simply there, asleep and vulnerable. The third and perhaps biggest problem was the absence of witnesses. The attacks happened in the dead of night. The victims were killed in their sleep, so they never saw their attacker. Anyone sleeping nearby would have been asleep themselves. The killer was like a ghost. He arrived, he killed, and he left without a sound. In a city as densely populated as Calcutta, it seemed incredible that no one ever saw anything. But the darkness and the city's habit of turning a blind eye to the people on its streets provided the perfect cover. The police were under immense pressure, the public was scared, the media was relentless, reporting on every new murder with sensational detail. The government demanded answers. The police department, led by the then Deputy Commissioner of Police Detective Department, Ajoy Kumar, threw everything they had at the case. They increased patrols in the affected areas. They put plainclothes officers on the streets, posing as homeless people, hoping to lure the killer into a trap. They rounded up hundreds of antisocials, vagrants, and people with mental illnesses, hoping for a confession or a lead. It was a dragnet approach, casting a wide net in the hope of catching something, anything. But it yielded nothing. The Stoneman was too elusive. As the body count rose, theories about the killer's identity began to circulate. One popular theory was that the Stoneman was part of a satanic cult or a practitioner of some dark tantric ritual. People speculated that the killings were human sacrifices. This theory was fueled by the seemingly ritualistic nature of the crimes, the specific method, the lack of motive, the focus on a particular type of victim. It was a terrifying thought, but for some, it made more sense than a random madman. Another theory was that the killer was a police officer. This idea came from the fact that the killings often happened in areas with a police presence, yet the killer was never caught. The theory suggested a rogue cop was using his knowledge of patrol routes and police procedure to commit the murders and evade capture. It was a fringe theory, but it showed the level of paranoia and mistrust that was gripping the city. The most common theory, however, was that the Stoneman was simply a deranged individual, a psychopath who got pleasure from killing. He was likely a vagrant himself, someone who knew the streets and blended in with the very population he was preying on. He could have been a construction worker, strong enough to lift the heavy stones, or just someone who harbored a deep, unexplained hatred for the homeless. The investigation was a series of dead ends. The police questioned thousands of people. They followed up on hundreds of tips, most of which were born of public hysteria. Neighbors reported suspicious-looking people, people with grudges accused each other. The police had to sift through this mountain of information, looking for a single grain of truth. At one point, they thought they had a breakthrough. A man was arrested. His name was often whispered in connection with the case, but his involvement was never proven. The police detained a man who was found wandering in the area of one of the murders. He reportedly had a history of mental instability. Under interrogation, he might have confessed, or at least implicated himself. But the evidence was flimsy. There was nothing to concretely tie him to the crimes. Without proof, they couldn't hold him. He was eventually released, and the file on him remained inconclusive. The police were back to square one. The number of victims is still debated. The official count was 13 murders, all committed between June and August of 1989. But some believe the true number was higher. The chaos and poor record-keeping of the time meant that other, similar deaths might have been missed or not linked to the Stoneman. For a few months, Calcutta lived in a state of siege. The city's nightlife suffered. People were afraid to be out late. The homeless, the most affected, lived in a constant state of dread. Vigilante groups formed in some neighborhoods. They would patrol the streets at night, armed with sticks and clubs, ready to take justice into their own hands. This created another problem for the police, who now had to manage public panic and the threat of mob violence. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. After August 1989, there were no more Stoneman murders in Calcutta. The killer simply vanished. The city held its breath, waiting for the next attack. But it never came. Weeks turned into months. The fear slowly began to recede, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. The police kept the case open, but with no new leads and no new crimes, it went cold. Why did the killings stop? This question is as much a part of the mystery as the killer's identity. Did the Stoneman die? Was he arrested for another unrelated crime and locked away? Did he simply move to another city? Or did he just decide to stop killing? Each possibility is as plausible and as unprovable as the next. The abrupt end to the killing spree left a void, a final, unanswered question in a story full of them. But the story of the Stoneman doesn't actually begin or end in Calcutta. To get a fuller picture, you have to go back a few years to another Indian megacity, Bombay, now Mumbai. Between 1985 and 1988, Bombay was terrorized by its own Stoneman. The pattern was eerily similar to what would later happen in Calcutta. The victims were homeless people sleeping on the streets. They were killed with a heavy stone or rock dropped on their heads. The motive was, once again, absent. The police in Bombay faced the same challenges: no witnesses, no forensic evidence, and victims from the margins of society. The Bombay Stoneman was blamed for at least 12 murders, primarily in the areas of Sion and Matunga. The Bombay police did make an arrest. They picked up a man, an alcoholic vagrant who was often seen in the area. Under interrogation, he supposedly confessed to some of the murders, but his confession was considered unreliable, likely coerced, or the result of his unstable mental state. There was no real evidence to support his guilt. He was held in custody, but he was never formally convicted of being the Stoneman. During his time in custody, he was being treated for his alcoholism. He eventually contracted an illness and died in prison. After his arrest and death, the killings in Bombay stopped. For the police, this was enough. They unofficially closed the case, believing they had caught their man. The connection between the Bombay and Calcutta killings is the most tantalizing part of the Stoneman legend. Were they the work of the same person? The similarities in the modus operandi are too striking to ignore. The choice of victim, the weapon, the time of the attacks, the lack of motive, it all points to a single traveling killer. If it was the same person, it presents a chilling timeline. He starts in Bombay in the mid-80s. He kills for a few years, then for some reason, he stops. Maybe the police presence gets too intense. Maybe he is almost caught. So he leaves Bombay. He travels across the country to Calcutta, another massive city with a large homeless population. In the summer of 1989, he starts killing again using the exact same method. He terrorizes Calcutta for a few months, and then he disappears forever. This theory of a single mobile serial killer is compelling. It explains the sudden start of the Calcutta killings and their equally sudden end. But it's just a theory. There is no evidence to link the two cases beyond the circumstantial similarities. No one ever reported seeing a suspicious newcomer in the homeless communities of Calcutta. The police forces of the two cities never formally collaborated to prove a link. It remains a piece of speculation, what if? That makes the story even darker. What if they weren't connected? Then it means that two different individuals in two different cities independently developed the exact same highly unusual method of killing. They both chose to prey on the same vulnerable group of people for no apparent reason. This possibility is, in some ways, even more disturbing. It suggests that the conditions of urban poverty and anonymity can breed the same kind of monster, that the Stoneman is not a person, but a phenomenon. The decades have passed since the Stoneman haunted Calcutta. The city has changed its name and its skyline. A new generation has grown up that only knows the Stoneman as a scary story, a piece of urban folklore told on dark nights. But for those who lived through it, the memory is real. The case remains one of India's most famous unsolved crimes. Over the years, the story has taken on a life of its own. It has inspired books, and most famously, a 2009 film called The Stoneman Murders. The film presented a fictionalized account of the investigation, offering its own solution to the mystery. But in real life, there is no solution. The police files are thick with reports, interviews, and dead-end leads, but the final page is blank. So who was the Stoneman? He was a shadow who preyed on those who lived in the shadows. He was a manifestation of the city's indifference to its poorest citizens. His victims were invisible in life, and in death, they only became visible as a statistic, a part of the Stoneman's gruesome tally. The killer understood the city's blind spots. He knew that he could kill these people and that there would be no outcry, no powerful families demanding justice, no one to mourn them except for other pavement dwellers who were too scared and powerless to help the police. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that the Stoneman could have been anyone. He could have been the quiet man you passed on the street every day. He could have been a laborer, a shopkeeper, a drifter. He lived a life of complete anonymity, and he used that anonymity as his greatest weapon. He proved that a person could commit more than a dozen brutal murders in the heart of a major city and simply walk away, never to be heard from again. The legacy of the Stoneman is not just about the murders themselves, it's about the questions that remain. It's a story about the vulnerability of the poor, about the limitations of law enforcement, and about the capacity for darkness that exists within a society. It's a reminder that some monsters are real and they don't always get caught. They just fade away, leaving behind a trail of bodies and a name whispered in fear. The Stoneman of Calcutta was never a person. He was and remains a terrifying question mark. And the answer to who he was is lost to time, buried somewhere in the crowded, sleeping streets of a city that has tried its best to forget him. But some ghosts are not so easily exorcised.